everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Catherine Fleming Bruce, and many of you who are in the sound of my voice, we're thankful that you're able to hear us, that you have power, that you're safe. We've just come through Hurricane Milton in Florida. Those of us in the 6 or 7 states that have been impacted by Hurricane Helene are still in recovery. So there are many things that are taking our attention. I want to add another thing for your consideration today. I want to add the impacts that we're going to have as we try to cast our vote, either in the coming weeks. Some of you may already be casting your vote in various states. Some of you will start, as we will in a couple of weeks, with early voting before Election Day on November. But we're asking if we're ready and what it's going to take in this situation where there's so much devastation through these natural disasters. What resources and what actions are going to be necessary to make sure that there's no individual who has unsurmountable barriers to get to the polls. So we want to look at some of our states that have been impacted. We have 6 states that have been impacted by Hurricane Helene. We're going to look at those FEMA maps and take a look at the large areas. Here's North Carolina. This is the most recent FEMA map for it, the disaster area in the western part of the state. South Carolina here has a large impact area as well. Some are going to be divided, of course, what you see between those that have individual and public assistance and those that just have perhaps public assistance, maybe less impacted. Another FEMA, and this is the Hurricane Helene map, FEMA map for impacts in Florida. And Virginia is also one of the declared states here that was just declared a day or two ago. You can see some of the impacts there. And Georgia, of course, those of us here in South Carolina, Georgia was the place where the hurricane came to us, and it shifted a little bit to move more towards Augusta, Georgia, but you can kind of see that shift there as it happened. And Tennessee was also impacted, had several counties there that will need attention and is going to receive federal attention because of this FEMA declaration. And finally, this is the Milton Declaration for Florida. And you see the entire state almost has been impacted. And this was the Okay, I think we had a little interruption here, but I think that's to be expected given all of the impacts, the very impacts that we're talking about, the impacts on internet service, power, and other things that are happening. So I also want to let you know that even though the press is heavily covering all of these issues, power, water, food, human recovery, all of these things that are happening, we also see more of the press talking about the impacts on the election. So this is a show that was on C-SPAN not too long ago that's focused on that. So we wanted to amplify that conversation today. And we have several individuals here who have graciously decided their time, and I'm glad that they don't have any interruptions that we're going to keep them from joining us today. So I'd like to introduce you to Courtney Kahn. She's a staff writer at Democracy Docket, the leading digital news platform dedicated to information, analysis, voting rights, So she covers voting rights, litigation, and legislation throughout the country. And she produces the Democracy Docket daily newsletter. Before that, she received a degree in journalism and government and politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. And previously, she covered local news at MoCo 360. So, welcome, Courtney. And I'd like to allow you to have the floor and make a brief introductory comment.
For I really appreciate you holding this discussion. As you said, I work for Democracy Docket, covering voting rights and election-related litigation and legislation. Over the past week and a half or so, I've been covering the impacts of Hurricanes Helene and Milton on voters in multiple states, and how that will impact, how elections will be run. Because again, we're less than a month out from Election Day, so there's a lot to be said here. So I appreciate you holding this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to introduce our second guest, Antonio Ingram II. He's the senior counsel at NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where he works on voting rights and educational equity cases. Mr. Ingram serves as part of the litigation team in the South Carolina NAACP versus Alexander. There's a federal lawsuit challenging South Carolina's racially discriminatory congressional and state house legislative maps. He's a graduate of Yale and UC Berkeley School of Law. Worked as a litigation associate at Morrison and Foster and Boyce Schiller Flexner, and previously served as a federal judicial law clerk for the Honorable Ivan L. Lamel in the Eastern District of Louisiana in New Orleans, and also for Chief Judge Roger Gregory for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, Virginia. He completed a Fulbright Public Policy Fellowship in Malawi, where he worked for the Malawian government and served on their Anti-Corruption Bureau. So welcome, Antonio, and I'd like to open the floor to you to make a few introductory comments.
Thank you. And yes, happy to be here. Thanks for holding this important discussion. We're in an election year, and there's, a lot of sort of climate change related issues that are making these hurricanes even more devastating than in previous years. And I think it's important to think about how this does really impact voters, especially Black voters in many of the impacted states.
Thank you. Thank you. And really what we're talking about is election infrastructure, all of the parts that make our infrastructure strong. So that includes our staffs, of course. It includes our precinct polling places. It includes our state commissions and sometimes the Secretary of State, because in some states, those are the folks who run our elections. Our machines, our people like our poll workers and all of those folks able to get to the polls, and our voters able to physically get to the polls. So all of the infrastructure is interrelated. We have schools, we have fire stations, we have churches, we have community centers that are all used as polling places. So the repair and restoration of all those places are going to be connected to what we're doing. So before we get into our discussion, I'm going to do a brief PSA for the part of the infrastructure of the human part, which is the poll workers. So let's roll that brief PSA. Hi, everyone. Catherine Fleming Bruce here with a quick election question for you. What happens if everyone shows up to vote for early voting or on Tuesday, November 5th, but there aren't enough poll workers? Without the people who make up our election infrastructure, you'll have closed voting places, long lines for the ones that are open, and people giving up and going away without voting. Kind of a passive-aggressive voter suppression. We won't have a strong democracy without critical people in place to help. Thankfully, there's still time to sign up online for October poll worker trainings at scvotes.org or visit your county election office to apply. I also encourage every voter to download and read the 2024 South Carolina Poll Manager's Handbook, brand new and online at scvotes.org. Finally, if you want to join our effort to increase the number of folk in every South Carolina precinct who know our voting process and are ready to be trained as paid poll workers or volunteer nonpartisan poll watchers or election protection helpers, sign up here today. Thanks for being the spark that keeps our democracy going. And with that, are moving to a conversation about the components of our state elections that could be interrupted by these disaster incidents that we have had. So certainly having poll workers that have already signed up and have already been trained, you may lose a good number of them because they can no longer get to the polls because the roads have been destroyed. They don't have power. There's a number of things. So I want to look at this article by one of the Georgia papers quickly. And this official says that they don't expect major voting delays due to storm damage. So I'd like to get some from our two guests, the components of state elections that could be interrupted, and how do we figure that out? How do we expect our public officials to figure that out? Tell us what's going on. So let's start with Courtney, because she's been out there talking to folks. What are some of the issues that we could see happening?
Yes, definitely. So there's really multiple aspects of elections that are affected by the hurricanes. I mean, first, as you mentioned, obviously, poll workers and election officials, a lot of them, aren't able to get to the polls due to damaged infrastructure or what they're dealing with in their own lives with homes being destroyed and things like that. So again, you have shortages of poll workers, which is already an issue, but is exacerbated by the hurricane. You also have issues with mail-in voting. So we've seen the U.S. Postal Service have a lot of delays and issues because, due to the hurricane, they have to close a lot of their facilities and post offices. So again, voters trying to send in mail-in ballots, trying to send in voter registration forms, and also election offices trying to mail their voters materials. So we see a lot of delays in that aspect, specifically affecting mail-in voting, so that's a big concern. And then something we've also seen is in-person voting as well, right? So as you mentioned, early voting sites and election day voting sites being destroyed by hurricanes and, the infrastructure not being able to support voting. And so you see counties and jurisdictions having to scramble to put together new polling places. And you also see voting equipment getting damaged. So you see all of these kind of different aspects. We also see issues with voter registration, right? So a lot of the voter registration deadlines have been approaching. Florida's was on Monday, for example. And you see a lot of people register, in the week leading up to the deadline in their state. But a lot of people, for example, in Florida recently have been evacuating or, making preparations for the hurricane, or in the case of Helene, reeling in the aftermath. So people aren't really thinking about voting and voter registration when, they're trying to think about their livelihoods and things like that. So, you also have issues with voter registration, people not being able to do it. And in states like, I'm using Florida again as an example because, Milton there, a lot of Florida doesn't have same day voter registration on election day. So you can't go in on election day and register. So if you're not registered by the deadline, you can't vote in this upcoming election. So, we can, get into this more later as well, but there are lawsuits going on right now in Florida and Georgia, about extending the voter registration deadlines. Florida, a judge recently, denied the request to voting rights groups request for that, but that's something that we see as well in terms of voter registration deadlines. So that's kind of just a big overview, all the different aspects of voting and how voters themselves can be impacted, and the barriers to voting that occur when hurricane strike, right? And election seasons are normally coincide with the peak of hurricane season. So this is definitely not something new. This is something we've seen. But obviously, this year we have two storms that are, historically, very damaging. So this is definitely something that we've seen and will probably continue to see.
Yeah, that is a good point. The fact that the two seasons are intertwined, and some predictability might be there. And so, how do we anticipate what happens and make sure that we're able to address that? So, Antonia, we have people who are going to the courts to try to address these issues and try to make these changes. And thankfully, in some cases, the court has not been damaged and is able to accommodate these hearings. But what do you think is the strongest argument that is being made for making sure that these lines are pushed back, that these deadlines for voter registration are pushed back? Can't hear you.
I am on mute, sorry.
Okay.
I would say this one of the strongest arguments is when you look at historical timeframes when people register to vote is usually in a week before the election deadline to register. And so in many states, they were under evacuation orders. They were unable to do in-person registration due to hurricanes. And so we see some states like South Carolina after litigation line by a week to accommodate these voters. And some states like Georgia and Florida resisting those changes and courts being unwilling to request them as well. And I think it really goes to the importance of having everyone participate in democracy, especially in things that they don't have control over. They did not cause the hurricane. They could not prevent their displacement and their evacuation. And now they may be, unfortunately, disenfranchised effectively for this next election season if they're unable to register in a timely manner.
And I do want to point to the fact that some of the advocacy has been focused around voter registration. I haven't heard as much advocacy about the other elements that we talked about the condition of polling places, about and certainly there is a mail-in deadline for getting those mail-in ballots in. So that's a deadline that we could see moved. We also have early voting that has certain deadlines. So for instance, in our state, it might be 8 to 5 that people can go Monday through Saturday, and Sunday is not one of the dates. So the possibility of extending the time for people to early vote could exist so that they'd have more time to get there. So that might be 8 to 7, or 7 to 7, the way it is on election day for most of us. And also moving the deadline for mail-in ballots to come in. And in the case of South Carolina, for instance, those are electoral laws that would have to be changed by the state legislature coming in or some other kind of action. So I wanted to have a little bit of conversation about how important it is not only to do the voter registration change, but also to address the issue of the deadlines for mail-in ballots and the deadlines for people to come in and vote in person. Courtney, what do you think?
Yeah. So, as I was, starting to say before, and I'll get into a little bit more now, is, mail-in voting, it's inevitable at this point that there are delays, right? Because, with U.S. Postal Service closing, their post offices, delivery facilities, things like that, the mail is just going to be really delayed. And as you were mentioning, there are certain states where, even if the ballot was postmarked by election day, it has to be it has to arrive by a certain day. But with delays, it's like, that becomes very difficult. And as you were saying, some states, that's how the law is. So in terms of voters being disenfranchised, unless the legislature can get in there and pass some kind of emergency measure and then have the governor sign it in these states, like these people aren't going to be able to cast their votes, especially if they're unable to get in person, if they've evacuated to another county or another state, and they can't hand deliver their ballot, which I know is an option in certain places, which is a very helpful option for certain voters. But if they can't go in person to hand deliver it, then, they kind of get into this situation where, they are unable to cast their ballot. So, we've really been seeing issues with mail-in voting, also with a lot of election offices being closed due to the hurricane. I know in North Carolina, there were numerous in Western North Carolina that were closed, and I'm sure in Florida that's the case as well. They're also responsible for counting absentee ballots and, start in sending out, election materials and things like that. So when you have election offices closed as well, that, could even delay things even further and prevent people's voter registrations from being processed, people's absentee ballot applications from being processed. So there's also that aspect of it as well, with election offices being closed. So there really are a lot of different aspects there of, looking into that and how that can be addressed. So it can be addressed at the federal level, at the state level. So there are, a lot of different components to that.
Okay, thank you. And Antonio, do you have you heard of any legal action on some of these other concerns?
Yeah, I mean, not everything I think is resolved through litigation. Uh,
Hmm.
you can't litigate to rebuild a school that's been destroyed by a hurricane. So I think some of the solutions are at the local level and advocating before state election boards and local election officials to modify existing polling locations, whether it be schools or fire stations, and ensure that both they are accessible because they're still the American with Disabilities Act and other factors that has to be sort of adjudicated and evaluated when you're looking at suitable polling locations. But looking at, ways to really respond in ways that are not necessarily based on litigation and in the courts, because as we talked about, a lot of these issues are not really legally redressable. There's one thing to change a deadline, but you can't really litigate new infrastructure.
Of course, of course. I want to look at the one of the headlines from North Carolina, and it's going to show us some of the emergency actions that North Carolina took in response to these issues. So here, the emergency election changes approved to help voters in 13 Helene damaged North Carolina counties. So that is a wonderful example of what the states can do, I guess, to get on top of or to get ahead of some of the barriers that people face in this situation. Because the priority for many voters is not going to be what's happening with voting. It's going to be making their immediate needs addressed. So the people who are in elective office and the advocates are going to be the ones that bring these other issues forward to make sure that they're going to be addressed. And I wondered if one of you, Courtney, if you could talk a little bit about what North Carolina is doing. You've had the opportunity to talk to some of the election officials there. What are some of the things that they're doing?
Certainly. So the North Carolina State Election Board, they had some emergency meetings and they passed a pretty comprehensive emergency resolution that's going to make multiple accommodations for voters and election workers and give county election boards a lot of flexibility. So, for example, the resolution will allow county election boards to move or add or remove early voting sites, and election day voting sites pretty close to the election, because normally that's something that's not as flexible, but they're allowing for that flexibility. They're also going to allow counties to establish voting places outside of a certain precinct. So for example, if voters in a precinct, there's not infrastructure for a polling place in that precinct, you can send the voters to a different polling place in another precinct. So there's flexibility there. And also, we were just talking about poll worker and election official shortages. This North Carolina resolution would allow poll workers and election officials who are residents and voters of other counties, which again is normally not something that's allowed, but this is an accommodation that is being made. And also, I was talking about mail-in and absentee voting. They are processing absentee ballot requests up until the day before Election Day. Without that accommodation, it would have been October 29th. So, obviously, it's giving more voters times to get those requests in for an absent. For example, if they were planning on voting in person, but now they can't, they have more time at the last minute to be able to request.
That's very impressive.
Yeah. So that is a change that was, and again, I tuned into the board meeting, and that was a change that was discussed a lot and kind of really brought into the spotlight there. Just running through a couple other things. Voters ballots to any by 7:30 p.m. on Election Day, not just, their county's election office, which is normally the only way you can hand deliver ballots on the day of, but they're making it more flexible. If you've, for example, in North Carolina, it's mostly the western counties that were impacted. So if you've been displaced to an eastern county, you can, submit your ballot to whatever, the county board office or the voting site of the county that you're in. So there's a lot of, flexibility there if you've been displaced to another state or even just a county within the state. And then finally, they have multi-partisan assistance teams that normally help with voting in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, voters with disabilities. But now they will be sending those teams to disaster relief shelters and other places providing relief to help to really just assist voters make sure that they can cast their ballots in this really, trying, difficult time where they may not be at home. They may not have access to their belongings. There's a lot they're thinking about. So there's a lot of accommodations here that, the board had jurisdiction to make, working within the parameters of the law and their own administrative authority.
So let me make sure I understand who was making the changes. So was it the state legislators that made the change, or the county boards, or did the legislature allow the county boards to have this flexibility and make these changes?
Yes. So to clarify, this is the state election board that made these changes.
Mm-hmm.
So the state election board made these changes for the county election boards.
Okay. So that would be, I guess, like in South Carolina, our state election commission.
Yes.
That would be that. So, okay. So they have the do that. So Antonio, I guess there's a difference in different states about what the state boards or the state election commissions can do to make these changes, or with this, and sometimes it's a state legislature that has to make those changes. Help us be real clear on how to understand who is responsible the various for creating this flexibility in our elections.
Yes, every state has their own election apparatus. Some states is more heavily based on direction from their General Assembly or state legislative body. In different states, it's more based on agencies that are tasked with election administration. However, I think what's really important is not just that these institutions, whether they be legislative or executive in their sort of authority, are able to really communicate the changes that are being made. Because, for example, the reason why states like North Carolina have prohibitions on modifying election polling locations a certain period of time before the election is because it causes voter confusion. And so my concern, I think a lot of people's concerns now, is while they are accommodating people due to the hurricane and allowing there to be additional locations, there has to be really a lot of advocacy from nonpartisan voting rights groups and people on the ground to really inform people of where the new polling location will be. Because if there's a new location but no one knows how to access it, it doesn't really help increase voter turnout.
Okay, so you're saying that flexibility is important and that those folks have that flexibility to make these changes that are necessary, but there's also the communication component that's critical to making sure that people know where to go and know what to do, and they're kept up to breast of what's happening. That's a good point. That's a good point. And I'd also say it's another challenge because there's still a lot of people who don't have their power, still a lot of internet concerns. So we may have to go back to the old school way of communicating to people, knocking on doors and having a neighbor to neighbor kind of communication. That makes sense. Well, let me go to some of the other slides that we have just to show what some of the other states are doing. I'd like to show the Virginia and the Florida and the South Carolina slides, if I could, real quickly, just so we could see some of the headlines about what's going on there. So here we've moved from North Carolina that has so much heavy impact to Virginia, which has less impact. And they say, hey, we don't have a whole lot of power outages here. We have other concerns, but that's not going to be one of them. So they will probably be able to make their changes and be more flexible, but they don't have as much to be flexible about. Go to the next one. And here in Florida, we're seeing some of the litigation that took place there with regard to, and this was prior to Milton. Is this something that either of you can share a little bit more with us about what was happening in Florida and what some of the case was about in Florida? Courtney?
Yeah, I can start just with, what I've seen through my coverage. So yes, so there was a lawsuit filed in Florida by the League of Women Voters of Florida and also the Florida chapter of the NAACP. The Southern Poverty Law Center filed that lawsuit on, behalf of those organizations. And basically, they asked Governor DeSantis to extend voter registration. And so after he did not do that on Monday, which is when the deadline was, they filed a lawsuit and an emergency motion in court so that, they could reopen registration for at least 10 additional days to give voters an opportunity to register if they haven't yet. And as Antonio was saying, and as we were talking about earlier, a lot of people register in that week period before the deadline in their state. So that was one of the big justifications. And, just with registration, again, like we talked about, a lot of people were evacuating, a lot of people were making preparations, so they were unable to register. In Florida, a judge did rule that he would not grant that request to reopen registration. So as of now, Florida voters are not, if they were not able to register, they cannot at this point. There was, also, there's also a case in Georgia. There's a hearing today, and in the case in Georgia, also filed by voting rights groups, trying to extend their voter registration. So there's kind of cases those are kind of the two big cases that have been widely discussed in terms of voting rights. So that's kind of, the action that has kind of been taken in court, especially when groups are courting, for example, Governor DeSantis, Secretary of State Byrd, asking these officials to make accommodations. And if it doesn't come from there, then they bring it to the courts. But so far, the Florida lawsuit has been unsuccessful. Georgia, so far from local reporting, we've seen that the judge in Georgia does seem skeptical of the request. But again, we are waiting to see from today's hearing what is going to happen in that case, if their voter registration will be extended or not, if they kind of get the same outcome as Florida. So those are kind of two big cases that Democracy Docket is tracking and looking at.
Antonio, anything to add to those reports about Florida and Georgia?
Yeah, I think one thing that opponents to having a more flexible voter registration deadline have raised is that in some of these states, if you extend it, you have a situation where early voting has begun at the same time that technically registration is still open. And I think judges do have concerns about the type of logistical quagmire that may cause. I will say the fascinating thing about South Carolina, where the judge did rule in favor of extending the deadline, is that a new deadline is on the 14th, and early voting doesn't start until after the new registration deadline. And so that may also be sort of factors that get weighed in as courts are assessing the logistical and legal justification to extend these deadlines.
Thank you. Now I want to go to South Carolina since you brought that up. Let's look at our South Carolina graphic that we have. Most recently, reporting on some of the electoral action in that state. So here we have South Carolina did get the voting rights extended. However, we have South Carolina legislators saying that they will not return to the state house for early Helene relief. And one thing that we talked about is what is the state of the buildings where the polling and voting will be taking place, where people are going to be early voting. What's the condition of those buildings? Are the election officials able to move to another facility and notify people of that? Would relief help to address any of those issues? And so that would be a question. Now, North Carolina, it looks like they, I don't think their legislature addressed this issue because they probably had done that in a previous year. So the election board was able to go ahead and meet because they had the power to do these things. So we're not sure what the South Carolina situation might be, but the legislators had the opportunity to talk with the public about what the conditions are in each county, how many of those election polling places are damaged, what are they going to do about them? Are they going to make sure there's enough funding for those counties to be able to respond? So how do you think that may compare to, what we saw in North Carolina? Just a general question. Either of you can jump on it.
Well, I will say something else about North Carolina as well is the legislature passed and Governor Cooper signed a massive Hurricane Helene relief bill. So we are seeing some assistance from the legislature as well in terms of that. So just wanted to make sure that was clarified.
Okay.
And yes, and I'm not specifically an expert in in South Carolina how how their kind of election systems are designed and in terms of
Right.
authority,
Sure.
but it's definitely something, again, like Antonia was saying, every state has their own kind of election infrastructure. So certainly their election board and their commission can work to pass rules administratively. And, so that's something that if they follow in North Carolina's footsteps as well. But again, that's something that we'll have to see in terms of future action.
Right. And something that the advocacy groups in this state can take a look at. So that would be for them to explore and to share with the public. I wanted to turn at this point to what federal support is available. And my understanding right now, of course, FEMA is moving through all the states and setting up opportunities to provide assistance to people. But there was not a relief bill passed in the last congressional session, is my understanding. So I wanted to hear from both of you a little bit about what the federal government can do. I understand the Speaker of the House is so far has not set a date to bring Congress back to see if there could be any early funding that could be sent to the states, some of which might be able to help address any of these problems that the states find themselves in that will impact voting. So, Antonia, do you have any message about what might be coming from the federal government, what they might be doing, and what we might hope they would do?
Yeah, I think my hope is that there will be congressional action that will help ensure there's sufficient support and funding for impacted states. This will not be the first or the last time that we have sort of these huge crises in the midst of national elections. And so in many ways, while I wish there would be more sort of rapid action, this is a long-term problem It's going to require a long-term solution. And so I hope that they will, fortunately, in the future, lay groundwork so that there is better infrastructure to really respond to these issues when they arise, as climate change continues to make superstorms worsen in our country.
That's a good point. It is something, because these seasons are together, as Courtney mentioned earlier, and we see the hurricanes becoming stronger, more frequent. We will see these things again. And some might say, we had some hurricanes in previous years that maybe could give us a clue that this is what we would be expecting, and to take some steps so that the legislature doesn't, and Congress doesn't have to come back and address things, but they may put in some emergency language that would help. Courtney, what would you say? What do you see is happening right now at the federal level?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, actually, this is a story I covered earlier today. There
Mhm.
were a group of congressional Democrats. It was an effort spearheaded by Georgia Congresswoman Nikema Williams, and basically, dozens of congressional Democrats sent letters to President Biden's administration and the U.S. Postal Service as well, in terms of what Biden's administration can do. What they're asking for is for them to allocate FEMA, specific type of FEMA funding that can be allocated directly to the statewide election offices in 7 different states. So including the states we were talking
Mm.
about, like South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida. So they're specifically asking for $500,000 to be allocated to each state's, statewide election office, so that, to be used for election recovery, making sure that they can still hold their elections. So this funding could be used for deploying, mobile voting units. It could be used for providing hazard pay to election workers, relocating polling places, replacing voter equipment, things like that. So, obviously, there is a lot of disaster relief available, but what these members of Congress are asking for is specifically for FEMA funding to be directed towards the statewide election offices. And then these, congressional Democrats also sent a letter to the U.S. Postal Service for what they can do at, the federal level, to the Postmaster General, in terms of prioritizing election mail,
Mhm.
perhaps over other mail, because obviously there's delays and there's limitations, and then also just increasing communication with voters and with election officials about, hey, your mail's going to be relocated here, it's going to be held here. So making sure that that process is as smooth as it can be, obviously, with everything happening. So we've seen these members of Congress seeing, okay, Speaker Mike Johnson is not calling us into session to pass legislative action. Let's go to the executive branch and see what they can do on their level. So there is some action there that can be taken as well. So that's just what some, about a group, I would say about like, 30 to 40 members of Congress are asking for. So we will see what the response to that will be. But those letters were just sent today. So again,
Wow.
very recent development.
Wow, very timely. That sounds
Yeah.
great. And do you know if those letters, if it is going to be something that is emergency for this year, or if it's something they'll say, okay, let's put in emergency language that in the event that this happens in a future year, you have a way for this to happen. I don't know if I want to say automatically, but we don't have to come back and ask for this assistance again. It will be in place.
Yes. So this is more of like an emergency action type of request, specifically for this circumstance. Could it potentially serve as a precedent for activists in the future on what they ask for, or what a president, feels they have the authority to do? Sure. But in
Mhm.
terms of what the letter's actually asking for, they're just asking for this emergent relief for this specific situation for these specific states that have been affected. So that's kind of what they're
Okay.
approaching their request with.
Well, that sounds like it is exactly what we are talking about. How to make sure that there's some attention paid to the electoral systems and their ability to assess damage, repair the damage, or create some action to make sure that there's that destructive element is mitigated. that sounds like exactly the direction that we need to go in. So I hope that people will look for that letter online if they're able to find coverage in Democracy Docket about that letter, and reach out to those members of Congress in support of that kind of action. That would be something that the ordinary citizen could do. I want to jump back to Antonio, see if there's any other idea or thought that you want to share about that particular set of letters that's going out.
Yeah, I think as we talked about before, state election administration is governed oftentimes by state officials, but that doesn't mean that there's no portion of advocacy that can come from the federal government. There are many access points to funding that places like South Carolina really could benefit from if Congress took action. And so I think it is important, as you said, to have people advocate on a multi-front campaign to really ensure that everyone has, a safe and accessible and fair access to all election activities, and from registration to absentee voting to day of ballot casting as well.
Well, we're going to move toward wrapping this up. And, we really appreciate all the folks who have tuned in, and for both of you coming to be on our show today. I do want to say, I think we ought to be reminded that there were other hurricanes earlier this year that other states are still responding to. So, of course, we're very cognizant of those things that are impacting, these states and getting a lot of press right now. But there were some hurricanes early in August, and some other natural disaster impacts that people are still dealing with. So we're talking about these 6 states right now, but there are other states in the U.S. that still have these issues to contend with. So what I want to do now, with that in mind, is to ask our 2 guests what are the takeaways that you want folks to remember who are ordinary citizens, voters, advocacy groups who are watching this today, or elected officials, or folks who are in electoral offices. What is it that you would like them to do that will help make sure that we address these issues and challenges that these natural disasters are providing? So we'll start with Antonio. What's your closing pitch to these folks who are watching today?
Yes, I would say really listen to your constituents. We've been in touch with many Black voters across the impacted states, and many of them have had struggles really accessing the ballot in this next election season because of having to evacuate, having to relocate, having to, not be able to focus on registering for an election in the midst of a hurricane. And so I think that the stories that we've talked about today are ubiquitous. And I think that level of sort of impact and that level of sort of adverse lived experiences that many people in these states are facing right now should necessitate a policy response, a legal response. And so I think I would just encourage people to reach out to their elected officials and reach out to the decision makers in their communities to really ensure that they have their constitutional rights to really cast a fair and free ballot preserved for this next election.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Antonio. We appreciate it. And Courtney, you get the closing word.
Oh, great. Okay. Just to go off what Antonio said, so, at Democracy Docket, obviously, we cover a lot of issues, revolving around voting rights. And so, I think one of the most important things here is keeping people informed on what's going on in their state and other states in terms of litigation, in terms of legislation, in terms of what accommodations are being made, just the latest up-to-date news on where do your elections stand? What is going on with your voting rights? How is this directly impacting you? So I think, just making sure, and again, like local news outlets are great resources for that as well. So just staying informed and making sure that this information is being communicated out there where it's accessible to see, and just making sure that voting rights are being protected in the midst of extenuating circumstances like a hurricane. Obviously, there are threats to voting rights, as we've seen, it kind of year round, but especially now it's a really much more complicated situation. So it's definitely something that will need additional attention and, will need to be covered more. Again, this is something with hurricanes continuing to get worse. This is something I think, and as I mentioned earlier, with hurricane seasons coinciding with election seasons, this is something we're going to see a lot more. So I think learning about, from the media perspective, how to cover this, from, a community perspective, what you need to know about this and how to view this. So, if anything, I think I really appreciate you having this discussion to kind of, of course, talk about the damaging impacts of the hurricane on people's lives, but also remember that we are having an election and that voting rights still continue to be important as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for being here. Antonio Ingram with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Courtney Kahn with Democracy Docket, both good friends of voting rights everywhere in the U.S. as well as with the South. So thank you for your time. Those of you who are watching us today, we really want you to take away the importance of making sure that electoral processes are what's on the minds of your elected officials and your election leaders. Make sure they know from you that that's important and that you want to see everyone know what's going to be open, if there's going to be any changes, how we're going to make sure that people who are displaced or have experienced other kind of problems with the deadlines are going to have their full ability to vote. So all of us can convey that message to our state legislators, to our local officials, electoral, and our election office officials. And we can also thank our members of Congress who are talking to our current administration, asking them to provide funding to help our electoral offices to be operational. We certainly want to thank them and support that effort and make sure that we know, hey, that's something that's important to us, and it goes hand in hand with making sure that our power is here, making sure that we have our water and our access to our roads and our buildings that hold the places, not only where we send our children to school or that we have our community meetings, but they're also the places where our elections take place. And I'm going to make one more little pitch for our our voters who are disabled. Buildings that they are in, that these election offices are in, and that the polling places are being held, making sure that they are accessible to people who have these disabilities. So that's going to be an important ask as well. So I thank you all for joining us today for this very important discussion about hurricane season and the U.S. 2024 elections. We hope that you will take action, and we hope that you will ask our elected folks to say, hey, this is something that's going to increase as the years go by. And we want you to anticipate and put the policies in place that are going to protect our right to vote. And with that, I thank you for joining us. I ask you to subscribe, to share this message out today, share the link to this video, and let us know what you think in the comments. We appreciate you and have a good day.